Okay, today I'm going to talk about Christianity in Red Ice Radio, as the Red Ice TV, or you want to say. The purpose of this talk is not that I'm sort of trying to convert Henrik and Lana. That's not that I would mind if that happened. It's just that that's not really my purpose. I understand that people have different opinions and they draw different conclusions, and I respect their right to do that. So this is not like I'm sort of setting out to to convert anybody. And, I'm just trying. What I really want to do is just bring out the clear understanding of Christianity for the Red Ice viewer, because Red Ice actually never really entertains the idea of a traditional Christianity, like a legitimate traditional Christianity. So I want to, I guess, address those interpretations of Christianity that I've heard on Red Ice. They vary from the idea that the Romans invented Christianity, which is an interesting theory. The idea that the Romans invented it for the purpose of kind of getting a population that is subservient to the government, and there is a big deal in Christianity. There's a lot of interpretation that would indicate that a good Christian will submit to the government. But and they say this was even at the time was even a Roman government which was pretty persecuting the Christians, and that was the government that you were supposed to support. I'm not convinced. The Bible talks about the government quite a bit, and that it has a role, and the role of the government is to maintain peace and order, domestic tranquility and so forth. And the government is subjected to God, and in the Bible, the government is never, a legitimate government is never to act out apart from God. And so, to me, that's a qualifier that says, okay, you obey the government in as far as the government's obeying God, and if the government is way out of line from what God intended for a government, then you need to obey it. Certainly, even in the first century Roman context, the understanding was that if the government wants you to disobey God, then you don't obey the government. Well, that's right now with the kind of Marxist government we have, it seems like there's an awful lot of areas that conflict. There's an awful lot of areas that conflict with the government and God. One of the really interesting interviews that Hendrik had about Christianity was this guy named David Warner Matheson, and he has an interview called "Undying Stars in Christianity." And, the reason I found that was kind of interesting is, once again, it's another sort of alternative interpretation of Christianity, one that ignores sort of the face value interpretation of Christianity, and interjects sort of, or inserts this paradigm that Christianity in the Old Testament Bible is borrowing from other sources, and however, this is interesting about this David Matheson guy, is he at least acknowledges that there's this special language in the Bible in terms of prophetic symbolism and so forth that corresponds to certain ideas about the stars and the sun and the moon and so forth. Now, there's two ways to interpreting. Now, he interprets this as meaning that really the Bible stories were meant to preserve that underlying story of the stars and the moon, and it gets into sort of he ends up with a sort of pantheistic interpretation of reality, that we're all God, and we're all part of God, and so forth. Now, I would say no. The proper way to interpret this is that those things created like stars and the moon and the planets and so forth are really pointing to Christ. They're pointing to Jesus. It's the other way around. That Jesus is the ultimate story. That's the ultimate storyline, and it's not just a story, but it's truth in the sense that the word and the deed have become one. So, in other words, you have all these competing voices, all these ideas about creation and what is the sort of nature of creation, nature of reality, and so forth. And the proper Christian interpretation of that is that the creation itself is all there. The symbolism and so forth is all pointing to Jesus. That and that's a big difference between, say, a true Christian viewpoint and some of these reinterpretations that we're getting from Red Ice. And by the way, it's not an attack on Red Ice. I really enjoy Red Ice. I subscribe to Red Ice, and I need to renew my subscription right after I'm done this video tonight. I will be subscribing. Henrik and Lana, have a great production. They got a great channel where they bring up all kinds of interesting points. Most of what they're talking about in terms of the war on whites and the right for people to have self-governing, the type of societies they want, the type of people that they want to have in their nation building and so forth. They're absolutely right. Red Ice team is absolutely right about those opinions, and I think that's why they're so popular even amongst Christians, is because I think us Christians recognize the truth, no matter who it's coming from, and they're certainly telling the truth in those areas. And Henrik is one of the best interviewers that I've ever heard. I mean, he's really a great interviewer, and his guests will say that to him and tell him it. Here's the thing, though. I think that it would be useful for the purpose of this video is more or less for the Christians who are Red Ice fans, like myself, to understand what the differences are, and also for the non-Christians, to understand that this is how it works with Christians. This is, this is why, this is what we believe, and why we believe it. It's interesting. I'll give an example here from that we get this newspaper comes in at work, where I work, and it's one of these local small, not real small, Trenton, New Jersey is the capital city of New Jersey, but the Trentonian newspaper, and they got this commentator, L.A. Parker. So I wanted to talk about Muhammad Ali versus L.A. Parker, and this little talk will sort of help us to understand more of what I'm getting at here in this particular video. But so Muhammad Ali versus L.A. Parker. Now, L.A. Parker is one of these dime a dozen neo-Bolshevik Marxist commentators who is just pretty much a useful idiot for the people that own and operate the Western media and the Western banks and the Western governments. And so he's just a useful idiot for those guys. But he was recently writing a piece about some senator or some big shot in the government, a federal government. I don't really pay attention too much with, but who had this big shot in the federal government, a conservative, was saying that he thinks that the Spanish immigrant should be more intentional about assimilating. And so L.A. Parker, who himself is not white, was saying that when politicians and American politicians talk about assimilating, what they mean is becoming white, or taking on white culture and white values and so forth. Well, this L.A. Parker character, then he sort of indicates that the indications that calls for assimilation are wrong. Well, the thing is, then later on in the article, he has his own disguised assimilation that he wants everybody to assimilate to his neo-Marxist, his Marxist cultural Marxism, and he's talking about LGBT and so forth, and that's really the hypocrisy of this guy, L.A. Parker. It's hypocrisy because he's on one hand he's saying, you can't ask people to assimilate, and then in the meantime he's really has his own assimilation program that everybody has to assimilate to this LGBT or whatever, progressive cultural Marxist, neo-Bolshevik culture. And as a Christian and a white, I don't want to do that. But here's the point about assimilating, and if assimilation does in fact mean taking on white culture, that's 99.9% of what makes America civilized, came from whites. So, and now, I'm not saying that there aren't contributions from other people, but when the contributions are also characterized by civility and those sorts of things that make a society work. In other words, a contribution of gangster rap is not really edifying to civilization. So there are contributions that are negative, and we don't need them. Now, as far as Muhammad Ali, here's a guy who also known as Cassius Clay, who I believe has made that kind of such a great contribution to civilization. And what makes him great is not that he could punch somebody's face in. That to me is actually not a good thing. I don't like boxing, and if it was up to me, if I had my own little country, boxing would not be legal because it's so violent. But Muhammad Ali's contribution to civilization was the fact that he stood up to the military-industrial complex, to the point that he's willing to go to jail for it. And to me, this makes him a great citizen, because the military-industrial complex is evil, and Muhammad Ali called him out on it. He said, why should they go over to the Far East? Why should they go over? Those people aren't here bombing us or killing American citizens. Why are we, So to me, there's an example of a black person who has made a great contribution to civilization by standing up to the military-industrial complex. Now, I don't agree with Muhammad Ali's, and this is where it's going to tie into the previous section of this video. I don't agree with Cassius Clay choosing Islam as a religion, and I'll tell you why. Because he gives the reason for choosing Islam over Christianity, for instance, because Christianity has this element to it of laying down a sheep to a slaughter. That Jesus went and he didn't physically defend himself, and Cassius Clay and Muhammad Ali thought that it's a better philosophy if you physically stand up and defend yourself with physical means. And the problem with this is not so much that there's something wrong with defending yourself with physical means. The problem is you don't choose a religion because it's palatable to your philosophical demeanor. You don't choose religions based on philosophy. If you say, okay, well, this is philosophically satisfying or whatever, that's not a reason to determine whether something is true. You determine whether something's true is if it has historical veracity, and this goes back into to Red Ice Radio and their interpretation of Christianity. It's all based on philosophical preferences. Well, you have to ask yourself this question: did Jesus live? Did he die? Did he do miracles? Did he raise from the dead? Are those historical facts or not? And there are numerous people who set out to disprove the historical veracity of the gospel stories, for instance, and through a rigorous examination of the records and the accounts and so forth, have come back as believers. And I find that that's sort of, to me, the objective reasons. I can give you subjective reasons why I believe, but there's also the objective reason, is the fact that this is true, is actually something that happened. If something actually happens, you can't dismiss it. It's not dismissible unless you're satisfied with living in a deception. And so to interpret Christianity or the Bible and so forth, it has to be challenged historically. And there have, this is one of the things about some of these professors. What's the guy's name? Bart Ehrman, I believe, who works for the teaching company. Not that he works for the teaching company, but the teaching company picks up his lectures. Oh, by the way, that reminds me, I could tie this into it too. I do have I do have the latest, one of the latest teaching companies, Great Courses they're called. I think they switched their name to Great Courses, right? That used to be the teaching company. And now they're called the Great Courses. This is their, and I don't, here's what happened with me. I started buying some of their teaching, and if they're teaching something like, calculus or something like that, one of these, math or hard sciences, that's fine. There's no harm in it. But they have some agenda. They're all part of this kind of progressive culture, Marxist and things. I won't buy their courses anymore. What I'll do is if I want something, if I'm interested, I will find it on eBay. Somebody else bought it. I'll just buy it from somebody. I don't really want to directly support them, but this is besides the point. Okay, here's the latest catalog, and it's kind of strange because it's got things like how to play the guitar and how to take good photographs and finding your artistic ability. And then they still got this thing in here. Okay, explore the New Testament from the Gospel of Matthew, Book of Revelation. Okay, and basically this is one of these guys who tries to tear down, Bart Ehrman. Okay, he tries to tear down Christianity historically. Okay, then they got, guitar, cooking, Western civilization, just, improve your writing, play the piano. This is probably going to be a real doozy. This one here, study America's war. Oh man, I'm sure that it's from their point of view. It's like military-industrial complex propaganda. That's what I would expect from them. Then they got this one. Here's another one. Okay, this is in here. Okay. How historically did Jesus come to be seen as God? Okay, so that's the same thing. Now they're trying to, let me see who's the teacher on this one. Once again, it's Ehrman. Okay, so yeah, see, Bart Ehrman. And it's interesting because, so here's the catalog. There's one other one in here about the Old Testament from, historical, but this is an example of some, an outfit that's trying to attack the Bible historically. And, they send this catalog out. And I made one of the very first videos I made, I guess I've been on YouTube, I guess about 7 years or so, or maybe 5 or 6, 7 years, somewhere around there. I have a whopping 147 subscribers. And although I don't produce a lot of stuff, I had, what happened was I would have had more, but I lost one of my channels because they changed something. I couldn't find my password, and so I lost my first channel. And my first channel, that was back when you could post videos on other people's videos, and it was much easier to get hits. And I had videos with 30,000 views and stuff like that. Those days are over now. I don't know if it's just I'm shadow banned quite a bit, or what else is going on there. But at any rate, one of the first videos I made was on this Bart Ehrman and his historical attacks on Christianity, and that got a lot of hits because there are Christians that were have subscribed to this and found out and bought the course and had their faith challenged. Some of the common mistakes that the people are attacking Christianity on historical grounds is they have this thing called higher textual criticism, and there's rules to how they go about it. One of the things they said, and I heard this from a Harvard professor, a friend of mine was taking a religion course from Harvard. He would share his lectures and stuff with me, but professors would say stuff like, it's impossible to verify if you got a message from God. Well, that's not true. It's very possible. You see, if the prophet says such and such a thing is going to happen in such and such a manner, and it happens, then you can verify a message from God. So that there's these professors are full of these kinds of things that aren't really true. One of the things about higher textual criticism, one of the things they say, for instance, they have this arbitrary rule that if something seems like it makes the official story difficult, then it must be true. Okay, so this idea, for instance, of Simon of Cyrene helping Jesus carry the cross is considered, well, that must have actually really happened, because it seems like it would be a kind of a contradiction to the story of maybe Jesus carrying his own cross or something. See, so that's how they structure their approach to this. That's their hermeneutic. One of the interesting things that I found very interesting is that in textual criticism, you look for how should I put this, content and events that whether they're mentioned or not. So, for instance, if there's somebody claims to have like a document from Hitler, and he's talking about a particular theater of war, or something's going on, you can kind of date it from when that happened to what the thing says. And if he doesn't, if it's not talking about the eventual losing of the war or so forth, the losses they were suffering towards the end there, if that's not mentioned, then it's probably not at that point yet. And so I found this very interesting, because if you're going to use that tactic consistently with the Gospels, you notice that the Gospels, none of them mention the Pentecost, which was just 50 days after the resurrection. So the fact that was not in there leads me to believe that the Gospels were written within 50 days of the events. Is that impossible? No, it's not impossible. Look at how anybody can undergo an event during the day, and at the end of the night, the very same night, they don't have to wait 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, 90 years to write down what happened. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter. So what's wrong with putting it in within 50 days? Absolutely nothing. There's nothing wrong with that. So if you use their consistently use their logic, then maybe with the possible exception of Luke, because he went on to write all the Acts too, and if he wrote them right around the same time, then it would have been a little bit later. But for the most part, the Synoptic Gospels, or the Matthew, Mark, and John, there's a very good reason to believe they were written within 50 days of the events. So at any rate, that's how you're going to successfully defeat Christianity. You can't really do it just because you don't like it philosophically. It doesn't fit into your worldview philosophically. It has. So this is one of the things. This is one of the things that I think that is important for the Red Ice crowd to understand with Christians, is that we believe that these things actually happened, and that you have to be able to defeat them with historically. Somehow you got to go back there and be able to demonstrate that it did not in fact happen. Nobody is going to, for instance, deny that there's a universe. that because it's here, it happened, and you philosophically, actually, here's one of the interesting shortcomings of judging things philosophically. The idea that there should not be nothing rather than something actually is a more philosophically sound interpretation of reality. In other words, reality shouldn't be here. That would be sort of the fact that it is here. It is less philosophically satisfying, in this sort of hard logic approach to it. But at any rate, that's a big part of what I think needs to be understood between Christians and the Red Ice crowd. I guess also would like to talk about the overall trajectory of Red Ice and how it fits in with Christianity, because Christianity, Jesus, some of us, some Christians, believe that Jesus came and he is going to make this difference in society, and that the world will be restored through Christianity, perhaps before the return of Christ. So, in that sense, I think one of the things that resonates with Christians in Red Ice is that the idea that we agree that something wrong is going on. Excuse me. We agree that something wrong is happening, and I think we agree that the people that are doing the wrong are people who identify themselves as being Jewish. That they're the ones that are really, they're the ones that did the Bolshevik Revolution, murdered 60 million people or so. And they're the ones that were trying to do the same thing to Germany. And they have this cultural Marxist promotion of all kinds of sexual perversion and the breakdown of the family and the destruction of anything that seems like it was going to challenge the government and so forth, nuclear families, and this is one of the things they were doing in Germany before the war, and one of the things that one of the great things that Hitler took care of was kicking them out and restoring Berlin to some decency, and that's where Red Ice and Christians have a similar objectives is the idea that the world should be following a trajectory of righteousness, and now from a Christian's point of view, okay, we believe that, for instance, a family's structure, nuclear family, and so forth, is the right thing to do. Ultimately, because God makes these, He created things in such a way, in such an order, and we're honoring God when we honor that order of His creation. Whereas Red Ice sees it more pragmatic. That's more of them for more pragmatics. So that's one of the differences. And I'm not. Some of the criticisms that come up about, well, first of all, I don't really consider Roman Catholicism as a legitimate expression of Christianity. It's not really the model that Christ set before us. So if Roman Catholicism came in violently, you shouldn't hold that against Christ, because there's no way, they're a misrepresentation. There's also the idea of, you've heard this kicked around, Christians who say, for instance, that, you can't have morality apart from belief in God. And I won't say that. Everybody has morality. Everybody has their own morality. I think that argument, the reason that that argument gets convoluted is because people don't know how to sort of properly describe the limits to the argument. In other words, the argument is not so much that people who don't believe in God can't have morality. They do. They obviously do. Everybody has morality. Everybody. They each have their own idea of morality. The difference is that you can't have sort of an agreed upon universal morality apart from some kind of revelatory religions. Okay, so that's really more or less how the argument goes. That at least, if from a Christian point of view, for instance, Christian point of view on homosexuality is God created male and female. He's male flesh and female flesh, and there was a purpose and an order that was can be honored in the creation itself, and we're sort of expected to honor that order. Whether whether or not you have because of what we call the fall of man, that's another big issue. We got to get into the fall of man, but see, in a Christian point of view, it's the fall of man that introduced the homosexual expressions. Okay, and it's not just necessarily one of these free will choices. So I mean, there is a free will element to it, and you can choose, but the proclivities are in the biology, and so as a Christian, we're sort of saying that biology itself has fallen, and that's an example of fallen biology. So we're condemning. Well, we're taking the side of God's narrative and saying, this is not, in a perfect world, this would not be a biological expression, but since biology itself has fallen, this expression comes out, and our way of treating that is to identify it as such, as part of the fall, rather than trying to see it as something that's natural. That because it's natural, therefore it's justified. No, because nature itself has fallen. Okay, now this is really a big difference between us and Red Ice, I think, as Christians, because Red Ice has a worldview and a philosophy that my Red Ice logo in there. That's nice. Yeah. Red Ice has the philosophy that biology justifies things. That it's actually that it can't be wrong. This is a big this is a big part of the this is it. This is really, I think that's really where most of the difference between Red Ice and Christianity takes place. There is if you and see from a Red Ice point of view, then this biological evolution and so forth, you can't really have you can't make a kind of an assessment or judgment against biology that it could actually have a moral element. See that from their point of view, how can you have an immoral molecule, or how can you have an immoral electron or so forth? And this brings up another interesting point with the Red Ice and the biology thing and the white identity thing. Okay, because I, as a Christian, think that white people have every right to exist, and they have every right to have maintain a separate society if they wish, I mean, one thing you'll notice in the Bible is that God never, there's nowhere in the Bible where God promotes multicultural or multi-religion. It's always condemned in the Bible. The so any sort of ethno state fits perfectly into the scriptures, Old Testament and New Testament. Now, in the New Testament, there is a passage that says, in Christ, that in other words, if you're a believer, you're a Christian, there is no male or female, Jew or Greek, free or slave, but that's only talking about there's no value difference in God's eyes between those groups. The groups still exist. Didn't say that. So that's another one of the scriptures that always gets convoluted is this idea that scripture is not promoting the idea that there are no more Jews or Greeks, or there's no more male or female. It's obviously the Bible in the New Testament has a lot to say about Jews and Greeks and male and female and free and slave. There's a lot of addressing. There's never in denying that those things exist. It's just saying that the value difference in God's eyes between those, that's not how you make a value difference in God's eyes. The value difference in God's eyes is, do you belong to Jesus or not? And even, I might as well bring this up now, as Richard Spencer, even Richard Spencer had made that mistake before I've heard him talk about that verse in the Bible. And let me just go down this little tangent here for a second. I'll come back to what I was saying before. But I heard that Red Ice had interviewed Richard Spencer in 2015, I think it is, 2014, 2015. Anyways, I don't trust Richard Spencer. I really think that he's put up to steer the alt-right towards a sort of European Union approach, solution to the situation. He even says this. He didn't use the word European Union, but he has this thing called pan-European. And it's really basically, it's just cultural European Union. The European Union so far hasn't succeeded culturally. They just succeeded in terms of financially and things like transportation and bureaucracy and so forth. But they haven't seen. And Richard Spencer, I think, was put up to try to take the energy of the alt-right and steer it towards a cultural European Union. That's, to me, I don't trust this guy. And Hungary did not let him into the country. And he says, Richard Spencer even gives his reasons of saying that they are hyper-nationalists and so forth. So, in other words, Richard Spencer almost sounds like somebody who is working for the EU. And I think that the Hungarians are super smart, and they're onto people like him. They probably know their intelligence is. I mean, they're look at their prime minister. Mentions George Soros by name and so forth. So we're talking about people that are very aware of what's going on, and that's sort of my aside about Richard Spencer. But let me get back to Christianity Red Ice. So how back to biology versus ideology. Okay, Red Ice leans very heavily on biological justification for their ideology. So in other words, you're born in this land and you lived in this land and your ancestors lived in this land and they become familiar with this land, and the land has biofeedback into your genetic makeup and so forth. And I believe that that's somewhat accurate. I mean, I don't know how how pronounced that is, but I don't see why that wouldn't be. But to me, I mean, as a non-evolutionist, that's just the way God had created the universe. There's no sort of separate entity. There's nothing nothing's really separate. Um, when you get down to extreme subatomic physics and so forth, and zero-point energy and space and all that, you end up with a matrix of information. And that information it can be arranged in such a way that it produces what we see in nature. And that information, and by the way, I'm sort of just extrapolating a quote from Planck, Max Planck. Okay, Max Planck has this excellent quote. I save it somewhere in here, but I don't have it available right now. But anyway, he was saying this too, that there's a matrix of information. That the implication from Max Planck was that this is the mind of God, so to speak, and this is, it's intentional. That is one of the interesting things I liked about in the Hunger Games. You had the technology there where they could just sort of press the dog button, and the wild dogs come out, and that reminds me of the passages of Jesus feeding 5,000 with the fish and the loaves of bread and so forth, and the energy, everything you need to create all this, everything Jesus needed to create all the bread and all the fish and so forth, is right there in the background, zero-point energy. You just have to know how to instruct it and construct it and so forth. And that's not something that we have the technology to do, and I don't know if we ever will. We may someday, I don't know. I mean, the way God, I believe, has created nature is that there's an awful lot of stuff that is accessible to us. And just because something's accessible to us doesn't mean God didn't create it. See, that's one of the stupid things about scientists, the scientific thinking, is that somehow if you understand things, therefore God didn't create it. That's nonsense. It's ridiculous. That's and they often use this argument, the God of the gaps. They say, well, you don't understand it, so you say God did it, and it's the God of the gaps. And once we understand it, that means God didn't do it. No, God still did it. God's not just the God of the gaps; He's God of everything that is out there, including the stuff that's been filled in. And so that's such a lame argument against God, the existence of God. Is it doesn't hold any water. But back to this Red Ice and Christianity. This is a really important point, and that is the idea that isn't what makes humans greater than the animals, for instance, is the animals are more or less completely dependent on biology, and that humans have the creative power to dictate to biology, in a sense, their own biology, that we can come up with ideas that in a sense trump biology, that we can decide that this is using the intellect and so forth. You're now see, everything is either abstract or material. Okay, and abstract things are just ways of describing relationships between things that are material, or relationships between other abstracts. But it's those abstracts, this is the abstractions, the imagination and so forth, that gives us our sovereignty as humans. In other words, a free will and a responsibility and an accountability, and it's those things that are going to be of interest on Judgment Day. Okay, so now suppose that the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak, and so are you somebody who's going to say, well, I need forgiveness. The fall of humanity has expressed itself in my flesh, in my genes, and and so I need redemption. Okay, this is a big difference between Christians and red ice. I mean, I've often heard guests and Palmgren agreeing that we don't need a savior, and so that's a big difference. You don't need a savior. Why don't I believe we do. And so I don't think that just being white justifies anything. It's just it's not now I don't want to. Here's one of the arguments that red ice would have against Christianity, is that Christianity has this dynamic in it that's very inclusive in terms of if you believe, then you're in. Okay, and so it's believers that are in, not blacks or whites or whatever. If you're a black believer, you're in. If you're a white believer, you're in. If you're so. And so that it's an outlook that lends itself to multiculturalism, or at least it has that. Let's put it this way: it's a point at which the progressive neo-Marxists and so forth can intimidate Christians quite easily, thinking that including people in the kingdom of God means also including them in your nation. Which, okay, see, and that's two different things. There's apples and oranges. That's two different. Those are apples and oranges. It's not. It can be that way, and I mean, I personally, would not object to having a nation that was based on Christianity rather than some kind of ethnic, background. I would have no problem with it. However, see, a Christian should approach the world in such a way that they say, okay, well, I have no problem, but if you don't like that, you have every right to do something else. You have the right. See, this is where Christians get sucked into kissing up to the military-industrial complex and backing them up as they murder millions of innocent people, because we think that our values have to be enforced violently on the rest of the world. That this is making the world safe for democracy, for instance, which is really there's a stupid BS deception. This has nothing to do with making the world safe. What we're doing is we're making the world slaves to the Rothschilds. That's really what that means. Okay, so how many people do you want to murder, for that cause? See, so if I'm okay, 100% okay with anybody having a nation based on whatever ideology or race or whatever they want to do. It's not like the job of Christians to pay somebody to kill somebody else because they need to adopt, this idea that somehow globally, whether you're a Christian or not, there's no Jew nor Greek or male or female. It's not even, see, it only works if you're a Christian. Now what happens is the New World Order, this is another place where I differ from most people. See, I believe that the United States from its inception was the original New World Order nation. That's the original open-ended, sort of liquid thing where the people who are in charge, people who actually own it, are just using us to finance what they have, their plans for the globe. And Benjamin Franklin is considered a founding father. Had said that he promotes and anticipates an eventual global society that's governed by science. Okay, so that's United States. See, that was United States is it was a satanic idea from the get go, and that's why I just I'm here. I live here. I was born here. I pay my taxes, but I don't believe in America. I don't believe in a satanic nation. If you want a Christian nation, you got to split off from the United States. United States is the great Satan. I don't believe in secular nations. I don't believe in. I'm not a secularist. I don't believe in separation of church and state. I think that's an evil idea. That comes from Satan. If Jesus is supposed to be the King of Kings, why is he not invited to be our king? Why what kind of Christianity is that? Okay, yeah, Jesus. We worship you, but you're King of Kings, but not here. Somewhere else, some ethereal, spiritual, but not in reality. You're not invited here because you don't know how to do this. This is too sophisticated for you. This is separation of church and state. You couldn't handle that, Jesus. That's how that's my criticism of Christianity is why aren't we demanding Christ as our government official? Why that's, to me, that's how you honor Christ, and as King of Kings, Lord of Lords. You have him there, and instead of the secular clowns and puppets and so forth. Now, I mean, here's how this would work. Here's how I think it should work. Well, let me tell you. Okay, theoretical. Okay, this is my theoreticalist thinking. Okay, theoretically, so you have a Christian nation over here, and they seek to honor Jesus in their lawmaking and in their operation. And then over here you have some other nation, and they have some other idea, and some other religion, and some other beliefs, and some other, whatever, and that's their business, and that's fine. And you can compare the two, or how many hundreds there are, and there's 100 different ones. That's fine with me. 200, 300, 500, whatever. And you can compare. You say, okay, here's the people that are Christians, and are they doing it? Is it working? Or is it not? Now, what happens is we've been told by the liars that it doesn't work, that it's going to end in a bloodbath because, things like the 30 Years' Wars. Were they really practicing Christianity? No, not if you're going to do things like that. So it has to be, voluntary and peaceful. Now, that's theoretical. What's really happening? Okay, what do we actually see happening in the real world? Well, okay, you could see, for instance, there are Europeans, and I've seen this on Red Ice comments, and you got a lot of thumbs up for people who said, Christianity has done wonders in Europe. It's brought prosperity and peace and so forth and so on. And I think that's true. I agree with that. Okay, and we did see this period where there was all kinds of scientific discoveries. Most of your early pioneers in the scientific age were Christians, Faraday and Newton, and you can go on and on. There's a giant list of Christian scientific pioneers because, the idea is that they understood that, God created the universe. Science is understanding how God ordered the universe. It's basically science. How did he put it together and so forth. So you had this period, and now you have this period where people have reinterpreted science not to be, how did God create things, but how did this thing happen accidentally? That was a big accident. And it's funny. I used to talk to people on the street. When we were doing street evangelism, and they would tell us about things like Conway's Game of Life, or how the computer simulates evolutionary biology or whatever. Well, really, what you need to do is put your computer and everything into the washing machine and let it run for 500,000 years, and then get it out and see what kind of programs you got. That's if you come out with something better, if it improved the performance of your computer and the programs, then that's a good proof of evolution. That you can stir things up and smash them up and rack them up and break them up and charge them with lightning and and you come out with greater order. Then okay, that's great. That's okay, good. But if you use a computer simulation to try to, you're really proving intelligent design, because you had to intelligently program that thing. Use your intelligence to do that. You want to drag your computer behind your car when you're going down the highway, then plug it in and see what happens. If you get better results, then that's proof of evolution. And, so at any rate, I see what's happening now is this scientific, blinded by science. It's not even science, really, so-called. It's people who want to use science is so-called to as an intimidation. It's like the new priest class, with this whole global warming is settled science or whatever. Now all of a sudden there's climate change. And so this they've succeeded in a sense. The Bolsheviks, atheists, communists, and so forth, they succeeded in taking down Europe by taking them away from, I believe, faith in the true God. And later on we could talk about, the Old Testament and, the problems people have with that and so. But what's happened now, they've fallen away. They're getting this full dose of culture Marxism, and at the same time, the people who call themselves Jewish that own the world are sicking the Muslims on the white Europeans. They're sicking the Muslims on them. So, but God is allowing this to happen. See, so God, in my view, God is saying, okay, look, you rejected me. You try this Allah, for instance. See how you like that. And it's not going over very well now. The neo-Bolshevik element, the neo-Marxist Bolshevik element there that's running the world, controls all the media, pretty much, controls the banks, controls the Western governments and so forth. They're doing evil. And the pattern in the Bible with God and governments and so forth is if there's somebody doing evil, they can get away with it for a while. And God's going to use that for purposes of his own for a while, but eventually he's going to catch up to them too. And in the Bible, in the Old Testament, you'll see, for instance, that God has taken pagan nations, like the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and so forth, to punish these people that were doing evil. identify themselves as Jews. And so I think that red ice may be groomed by God to take that role of disciplining this group of neo-Marxists. That this is why I think that there's a resonance between red ice and Christianity, because Christians will resonate with something God is doing. If it's the true God doing it, Christians will resonate with it. Now, He's not having Christians do this. He's having pagans do it. Okay, maybe that's why I said at the beginning of this that I don't know if Lena and Henrik are going to become Christians. That God will use non-Christians quite a bit for certain things, and maybe that's not what they've been called to become. Now, to me, that's a sad thing. Obviously, you want, God can use people to carry out events in this world, but the individual still needs to inherit eternal life. You would still want that to happen for somebody, no matter who they are. So, but this is I say this because I'm very familiar with the scriptures. And by the way, I've read the Bible cover to cover 15 times in 8 different translations. And I'm going through now for the 16th time, and I'm going through the interlinear with the Greek and the Hebrew. I've also read the Quran 3 times, all the way through. I've read The Way of Zen and some of the other, Bhagavad Gita's and so forth. I've read some of the apocryphal books, like Book of Enoch and the books in the Catholic Bible. And my point in bringing that up is to say that I'm familiar with the things that God emphasizes, because He gives in the scriptures. There's so much press given to certain things. You can sort of, for instance, did you know? Christians are. It's funny because the pop culture Christian. God is love. God is love. Okay, well, that's true, and it's mentioned maybe 2 or 3 times in the scriptures. But about 200 times God mentions that He's the God that took the Israelites out of Egypt and did these miraculous things on the way out, and so forth. So it seems to me that God's main emphasis in Scripture is His historical veracity. That there's something that actually happened. You can look into it and find out. Did it happen or not? And there was often in the past historical biblical critics saying, well, this never happened, we can't find evidence. Then it shows up, and then all of a sudden, they got the evidence that they said that wasn't going to, wasn't going to manifest. So that wouldn't be unusual, and these are the kinds of things that keep happening over and over again. So God really, that was the, God knows how He created the universe, and He knows that anchoring yourself to historical reality is important. To the fact that then you have, in a sense, no excuse, because you can test like you would anything else and see what happens. It's no good comparing it to scientific ideas that people, they're going to be disproven eventually. That's one of the things about science, that it changes. It changes often and a lot. That this Laplacian universe of clockwork, that you could sort of, that still permeates a lot of cosmology and evolution is one of these gradualism kind of approaches to reality that's not, in fact, accurate. And so what I see happening then is that there is going to be a comeuppance for the people who started World War I and World War II, who did the U.S. liberty and 9/11. There's going to be hell to pay, and what's justified? What's justified, and what makes common sense? It's common sense, I call it, is to make sure these people aren't in your government. Okay, for one thing, first of all, they shouldn't have a role in your government. There's a place for them that God had intended. There's a land for them, and it's described. The boundaries are described in the book of Leviticus, and that's where God will allow them to be pushed when push comes to shove. Now, that's okay, and that's a justifiable thing, and it's righteousness that that must be served, that God will carry out. If you read the scriptures, you'll see one of the things that God often condemned the Israelites for is evil, immorality, and not just doing it themselves, but causing the people in the lands that they occupied to participate in those evil things. This is God condemning the Bolshevik Marxist invasion of Berlin. You could refer to the scriptures in the Old Testament. If Adolf Hitler had only really submitted to the God of the Bible, and that was his authority, things probably would have turned out a lot better. But he was acting according to the scriptures when he set out to dispel the Bolshevik invasion of Germany. That was word for word almost of just change the names, but it's the same principles from the Old Testament that God had prophets pronouncing against the Israelis for doing exactly those sorts of things. Which reminds me, one of these days I wanted to make a video about the alt-right Bible. The Bible itself has a lot in common with an alt-right worldview in terms of if there's we have, in a sense, some common morality that if you by default end up honoring traditional family, for instance, that's something that also happens to be in the pale of God's intentions for humanity, the way humanity is to be conducted. So you are right by default, and that unfortunately is not the same as being saved. So the what'll happen is if you do what Benjamin Netanyahu would like, that is for all Jews to live in Israel. If you help him in that project, that's fine. What you don't want to do though is then attack Israel. Okay, and this is where Christians and Red Ice crowd conflict quite a bit. Is that the Red Ice crowd often sees Israel as illegitimate, whereas Christians see it as something God intended, very much so. And those are two different things. The idea that God intended Israel, that land for Israelis, is different than saying God, is going to turn a blind eye to evils that are done, being conducted by Israelis. Those are two different things. God doesn't turn a blind eye to evils conducted by Israelis, and so that's where there's a conflict. Do you think do you believe Israel is legitimate nation and so forth? I do, and then that would earn me the label of a Christian Zionist. But where I differ from most Christian Zionists is that I don't believe, therefore, that Israelis can do no wrong. And unfortunately, that's how most Christians approach that. Is the sort of they almost think, well, look, Israel is the promised land, and they're going back into this land that was promised in the end days, kind of thing. And therefore, we gotta be very, it's a very fragile, sensitive, phenomenon. You got to be careful that you don't ever take sides with people who are criticizing Israelis for doing 9/11, for instance, because you don't want to upset. But that's ridiculous. Christians shouldn't be thinking like that, because if God made the promise, it's not fragile. It's going to take place. It doesn't matter what you do. You can't derail that. So you don't have to worry about, we don't have to worry about whether God's going to pull it off or not. And when you act like the Israelis can do no wrong, then you're actually contradicting God, because the Bible wouldn't be nearly as thick if you took out all the parts where God was condemning the Israelis for doing evil. So you have to have a worldview based on the Word of God if you are a Christian. So that's where that's kind of like what I felt like I needed to say about Christianity Red Ice. That I really think that it would serve Red Ice well to take this into consideration, that they do have a lot of Christian followers, and Christians don't believe most of the same things, and that how are you going to? So my point is, how are you going to accommodate? How are you going to accommodate? Without compromising. I don't expect Henrik Palmgren to compromise his convictions. If he thinks that Christianity is a myth or whatever, then he needs to act consistently what his beliefs are. I don't expect him to change because other people that follow his channel be Christians. However, how do you go about accommodating this difference? And I think the best thing is to acknowledge it and understand it. Understand the differences. That's what a big part of what I'm doing here is, let's understand what the differences are. And then seeing, okay, which parts of these things can we work together, and which parts of them must remain separate, and so forth. And to me, for instance, the way this would play out, let's suppose that you had Sweden break away from the whole New World Order and become really independent. Okay, Henrik would like to do that as a pagan Sweden. See, And I say, well, no, there's just way too many Christians there still. And so you don't want to, I don't think ultimately you want to have a multi-religious state like that where it's pagan and Christian. I think your best bet is to have two different Swedens. So my question is, would the Red Ice crowd be willing to sort of accommodate something like that, like a two-state solution, a two-state solution for Sweden? Because I don't think that you're going to be able to ultimately go forward with like a pagan Christian kind of civilization. I mean, you might be able to start that way, but I'm actually kind of afraid that if you had a pagan thing, that the pagans might not, they might decide to to attack the Christians. I'm actually kind of afraid of that, personally. I would rather that there was a mutual, separation of those two things eventually. Now, the things we can do together, of course, are to speak the truth about events, like, for instance, 9/11, World War II. Henry Ford, I would love, I don't know if, I haven't come across one yet. If Red Ice has done an interview about somebody who's, a good Henry Ford historian with his whole investigation into World War I and how he was going to try to stop World War I. He took an. If you haven't heard this, I'll repeat myself because I love this story and I tell it to a lot of people. But so the story goes like this: Henry Ford heard, okay, scuttlebutt, okay, World War I's, they're trying to world wars, whatever. They didn't call it that at the time, obviously, but a war was going to break out in Europe. So he was going to go over and dissuade the, the people who seemed like, going to engage in this war. And so he had an entourage of advisors, and amongst those advisors were some Jewish people. And the Jewish people told Henry Ford that this war is being started by Jews, and it's not going to stop until they decide it's over. And now Henry Ford didn't believe him, and he said, well, it seemed too incredible, but they were able to convince him. They had enough evidence and enough information and so forth. They were able to convince him. Obviously, these were, good Jewish people who were interested in telling the truth and being honest. And so then Henry Ford took up this campaign of warning people against these international Jews and their evil deeds, such as starting wars. You know how many millions of people died in horrendous death, chemical gassing and all kinds of evil, things that took place during those wars, and it was just to consolidate power for this handful of control freaks, and that's what World War II, same thing. They, persuading Woodrow Wilson, bring America into it, getting through Churchill into picking the fight with the Germans when the Germans were trying not to fight them. All those people that died, and the international Jew who started these things. They knew, for instance, that millions of other Jews would die in the process, but that didn't bother them. They only use the other Jews as human shields. That if somebody says, look, the evidence, there's overwhelming evidence, it just makes all kinds of sense that the people who owned and operated the World Trade Center are the people that facilitated the takedown. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, this was, Larry Silverman and Michael Chertoff, and there's a bunch of other people involved in the cover-up. There's a bunch of other people involved in, for instance, seeing to it that the property was sold to Silverman, and you know, there was a Jewish guy who was in position to make that transaction. The security companies, the involvement that, of the Mossad and so forth, the weekly phone calls from Benjamin Netanyahu, and so forth. So the evidence is overwhelming that that's who did 9/11, and what they'll do, you know, with somebody, you know, now they don't bother with me because I'm a nobody, but I mean, if I was a somebody and they heard me talking like this, they would tell everybody that I was anti-Semitic, and so that all the Jews, the entire Jewish population in the world, would think that I was their enemy, just for, you know, telling the truth about something that happened. So that's one of the things that we need to do, is get more Jewish people who are interested in the truth to blow the whistle on these guys. That would be helpful. But at any rate, this is what happens. These guys have, you know, control the media, movie making industry, you know, books, schools, education, everything like this, and so they can intimidate people into thinking that somebody like myself is, you know, out to get them or something like that. You know, I'm just the thing is, I'm just trying to look. I've been around long enough now. You start to figure things out. You say, okay, well, this is a scam, and that's a scam, and this is a scam, and that's a scam, and if the rhetoric of freedom was to match the reality, then the reality would be that the right now, for instance, the federal government, the job of the federal government would be to help split up the United States into small, different independent nations of people who have common values. I mean, you could just start right off the bat. You could start, if you want, with 3 different countries. You could split it into 3 right off the bat. You'd have the red, the blue, and the middle. And you know, the middle people are, to me, the phonies, actually. But that's where you want a nation of phonies. That's fine. The moderate, to me, moderate is just it's another term for phony. But that's besides the point. You know, real people live either on the left or the right, as far as I'm concerned, and they shouldn't be trying to force each other to stay together, which is common sense. You don't want to do that. You want to honor and respect people, and you want to respect people by allowing them to separate and to facilitating that separation. You know, that's the correct way to do that. I mean, that's the theme of the Bible. Read your Bible. That's the theme of the Bible: is separation of sheep with the goats, separation of light and darkness. Separate. You know, that's and the way of Satan is these forced unities. Okay, that's satanic. That's, you know, the Tower of Babel, and so forth. That's that's the mark of Satan. Satan. You can tell if somebody is a child of Satan is they will fight for unity of, you know, people that don't belong together. That's the mark of Satan, and that's you know, you don't like it, too bad. You know, that's, you know, live with it, figure it out. You know, why do I have to figure everything out for you? Figure it out. Stop and start thinking for yourself for a change. You know, tell me where I'm wrong. Figure it out. Tell me where, you know, can you tell me where I'm wrong? That would be great. I would love to hear it. You know, if you think it through, you'll say, oh yeah, actually, you know what? That makes a lot of sense. It's the right way to do things. That's how you respect and honor people, is by saying, okay, you know, we have these differences. We should have different governments and different, you know, borders and so forth. That's a no-brainer. Now, people see. Here's the thing: if you want, let's suppose that I was somebody who instead of being a Christian, I was somebody who believed in the United States, for instance. Okay. What I would do is I would say, okay, this is the United States. It's a secular nation. We practice superficial religion, if you wish, but your religion can't be strong enough to actually talk to the government, and we, shop at Walmart, and we watch NFL, and we enjoy diversity of sexualities and hair colors or whatever. Somebody has pink hair, somebody has green hair, somebody has lots of tattoos, somebody has a few tattoos, and that's diversity. That's it. And I would be kind enough to say, okay, but if you don't like that and you want something else, then this is a large landmass, and we will help you find somewhere here where you can split off and have your own country that does something different, that has a different set of values. That's the way, that would be an honorable, to me, see, that would be, okay, that's, that would be an honorable, position to take from the other point of view. If I was one of those other people that believed in sort of the American culture, I would at least have the decency to let people who didn't believe in it, take some of the land and separate, peacefully, and give them all kinds of, whatever tax money they, there's all kinds of land that belongs to the federal government, for instance, that should be given over to the people in the form of vouchers. There's a lot of things. I mean, to me, that's how you define freedom. And freedom is not, okay, the government owns 65% of the landmass. That's it's so funny that it's called the free world. These people are the free. And the thing is, see, I only would like to see change take place if it takes place because people are convinced, they're convinced in their minds and in their hearts that, it should change. I'm not interested in, revolutions or wars. It's just, think about these things. Think about it. Is this really, that's freedom? Is you got to bicker and, fight with people who you have nothing in common with, and and that's freedom, instead of saying, hey, look, we don't have anything in common, let's, split up. I mean, that's, to me, that's just a no-brainer. It's a complete no-brainer. And so what I'm trying to do is introduce the thought into people's minds that, okay, yeah, actually, you know what? It's just common sense. What happens if it, if it goes over like dominoes, and all of a sudden everybody's bowled over by the idea to the point that it can just happen peacefully without any kind of war or anything like that. Because, if, the government needs people to believe in it and to continue. And if all of a sudden, 75, 80, 85% of the people, 90, 95, then once you get to, if you get to about 95% of the people, even somebody who's really stubborn and really wanted, to think that they were going to control everything and continue to, would just say, okay, you know what? It's time for me to throw in the towel. I get it, especially if you get like 95, 90, 98, 99, 100%, that would be, that's how you do, that would be the way to go. 100% of the people are like, okay, you know what? Yeah, it makes sense. It's, we got plenty of land here. We got plenty of resources. Nobody's going to hurt. Nobody's out to kill anybody. Nobody's out to control it. We got, you guys could have this. We could have that. You could have this. You could have that. Now that would happen, I think, if people were mature Christians or mature anything. If you just grow up and control, stop trying to be a control freak or whatever, And control, it's funny how controlling is kind of, controlling is usually they said money, it says money is root of all evil. So the money is root of all kinds of evil, but the reason is because if you have a lot of it, you can control things. They're really the catalyst for making money evil is the desire to control, And so that's the other thing, you could tell, okay, if somebody says, okay, look, we have these differences and, you believe this, I believe that, there's, 50 million people that believe this and 50 million people believe that. Well, that's a lot of people. You can have two different countries right there, and then you have 50 believe this and 50 believes that. Now you got 4 countries and so forth. You could be 25 million, 10 million probably. And that's, to me, that's the sort of the way forward. And I think that's what happened. Okay, so let's go back to the scenario. Red Ice, there's this whole awakening where people realize that, hey, you know what? We have this group of control freaks that got into our banking systems and our governments and our medias and all this, and we're going to kick them out. And they got a place to go, and they're only going to go there. And then, unfortunately, people are going to go too far and try to attack Israel, and then that's going to be the catalyst. Somehow, I don't understand exactly how this goes, but somehow that's going to put the rulers, the leadership of Israel, into a place where they acknowledge Jesus as Messiah. Now, that's what the Bible prophesies is going to happen. When Jesus came the first time, it was the leadership of Israel that rejected him. And the leadership is the one that intimidated other Jews not to accept him. There was an awful lot of the common Jew that accepted him. And then, of course, when, the water got hot and things got scary and there was just, a smaller handful of people that stuck with him. I mean, they were afraid. They did all run, and hide, and Peter denied him and all that. But I mean, in the long run, they stuck there. They came through. He came back. He came up out of the grave and visited them and so forth. And that was the start. And they were Jewish people. And that's what happened. So this is going to be a second chance, so to speak. There's going to be the rulers rejected him, and there's got to come a time when the actual rulers of Israel recognize him as the Messiah. Now, I've heard quite a few sources that there's a lot of Israelis that believe in Christ, believe in Jesus as the Messiah. There's even, I've heard a lot of scuttlebutt about rabbis that believe that, but they just don't know what to do because, that's going to be a very explosive revelation. But look at the first century Jewish believer. They walked right into the explosive situations and got killed for the most part. And that's, I mean, that's one of the things I was talking about Muhammad Ali. I mean, you got to honor this guy. He actually went to jail. He was actually willing to go to jail to denounce the military-industrial complex. And these early Jewish believers in Jesus were willing to be rejected by their community and killed and so forth. See, the same kind of game was going on then. It's going on now. Is this intimidation factor? As if if you do X, Y, or Z, then you're anti-Jewish or whatever. See, so that same thing is going on today, and I think there's a lot of Jews who are intimidated, for instance, to get on board with 9/11 truth. Because they know as Israelis that did it, see, and that's what they're afraid of. They're saying, well, if we blow the whistle on these guys. They're going to come after all of us, and I don't believe that that's. I don't believe that's the case. I think what would happen is that well, it'd be a pretty explosive situation. I mean, I sort of, I sort of have a problem with the Jews that don't believe in Israel. That they believe, that's the, but they're more likely the ones that are also going to be, 9/11 truthers probably. Unfortunately, those things go hand in hand. I find myself a very sort of oddball out there in terms of somebody who's both like a Christian Zionist and a 9/11 truther. I'm somebody who, I believe, I actually believe that there should be. If I had a nation, if I had the nation of my wishes, there would be a religious, a Christian litmus test for being in the government. And so, I don't believe in this idea of, multicultural, multi-religious, configurations of governments. Really, I think in a minority of half a dozen people, maybe, and out of 7 billion. Okay, like I'm a Christian Zionist, but I also believe that you shouldn't have a certain ethnic group of people if they belong to that ethnic group, and that ethnic religion shouldn't be have anything to do with your government. And so I don't know how many other people there are that would share those two values. But ask yourself this now. A little while ago I read this thing about. I did this video called "Alt-Right Israel," and the Israelis have a statement about that Israel is a Jewish nation for Jews. But then they tried to do a little bit of damage control by saying, "Oh well, we have an Arab in the Knesset or whatever." But does that mean that Arab can work to make Israel a Muslim nation? Obviously not. Okay, so see, what does that mean for America? Well, unfortunately, America is a nation without definition. So it's not going to work for America anyways. America has never been established as anything particular. It's the original Marxist, humanist, Freemasonic. That's what America really is. But they don't say that. You don't get the founding FTARDs didn't. They were dishonest. They didn't come out and say, "Hey, by the way, here's what we're actually doing." No, they made it sound like, okay, look, you guys stay here, you'll have your religious freedom and everything like that. Where's your religious freedom now that you have mandatory like LGBT culture, What's that got to do with Christianity? And the founding FTARDs didn't care about that. They were all these deists. They were all Illuminatis, devil worshipping creatures that wanted to control things, and this myth has grown. This myth of they were really interested in freedom for the people. No, they're interested. They needed somebody to pay. They needed somebody to pay for all that control. You need people to pay for that crap. And so just tell them, oh yeah, you got freedom, and you get the government that you want. You got okay, like you're a Christian now, and this is the trajectory of America. This is the Christian trajectory. What we have now, cultural Marxism. You see that's this is satanic. It's a satanic It's a satanic nation. It was founded, it was, if there was a spirit dictating, it was the spirit dictating the Constitution, it would have been Lucifer. And so what do now? You're a Christian. Jesus is supposed to be Lord of Lords, King of Kings, and you find yourself, okay, you were born into this nation whose official God, unspoken God, is Lucifer. What do you do? You see, and I think that what you do is you talk about it and you expose it, and let people decide what they're going to do about it on their own. To me, it's just an exposure thing. The truth will eventually, take over everything. There's an interesting little saying, Chuck Missler. The truth is when the word and the deed become one. That's what I was talking about, historical veracity. That's why so much of the God of the Bible is revolves around historical veracity. So that's it. The truth is what is ultimately going to prevail. Now, so back to the scenario. So Jesus is going to come back when Israelis, the prophet says after 2 days they'll call him. 2 days. Days to the Lord is 1,000 years, right? 1,000 years is a day, and we're coming up upon the Sabbath of the 1,000-year days. Okay, well, 1,000-year day, is a day that is 1,000 years is defined as a day in terms of figurative language. Remember, we're talking about this guy with the figurative biblical language about the sun and moon and stars and all this. So the Jewish calendar, I think, it's somewhere in the area about 200 years now. It sounds an awful long time. I find it hard to believe it can go that much longer. Before, before there's such a destruction, But I think that before we get to the return of Christ, there's different interpretations of, different speculations, about what's going to happen. Is there going to be these crazy wars, and is there going to be all kinds of crazy famines and starvations, and a third of the populations being wiped out and so forth, or is that something that was figurative for what happened in 70 AD, and what's really going to happen is we're eventually going to ease on into the new heavens and new earth? I kind of think it's the former, but this catalyst, that will bring. Jews will call on him who they pierced, and he will return. And this was, one of the prophecies made, I guess 500 years before Jesus came, anyways, the first time, and so he will return to Israel, and he will rule the nations, but not in. I think it's not in the sense, because one of the things I see going on here with red ice is this idea that, the Israelis are actually setting up the kingdom, and they will usher in the Antichrist, which is probably going to happen too. Okay. But if that has to happen first, you're eventually going to get the real Christ. When the real Christ is here, there's still going to be nations. There's never a time in the Scripture where even in new heavens and new earth you have nations. It sounds like you still have separate nations. I think that God established that whole idea at the Tower of Babel. And by giving these people different languages, so they couldn't even communicate with each other, and they were forced to separate. Um, that is, even in the Old Testament, with the Jews, you had 12 tribes. They were even sort of subdivided. You know, and of course, Israel was taken, separated from the rest of the world. Which brings me back. Okay, I was going to talk about. Well, let me just finish the other thought about Jesus coming back. I think that he's going to come back, but there will be this idea of a diversity of nations still. This idea of having separate nations automatically results in hostility. The Marxist professors like to talk about hostile nations. We got to get rid of the hostile nations. But all the hostility comes from the people that are actually trying to orchestrate a unification under their own control. So the Old Testament. All right, yeah. So one of the things you often hear from here on Red Ice, and I guess I listened about 100 hours of Red Ice by now, is that probably be more than that, but anyway, is this idea that there's a schizophrenic God, the Old Testament God and the New Testament God, like they seem so different. My best explanations I will share with you, and you probably won't find it very satisfying. I don't necessarily I don't really see. This is the thing. That's why I don't judge things philosophically. You judge things historically, because if I had to judge things philosophically, I don't know if I would be a Christian, because philosophically there's a lot of difficulties. You run into a lot of strange conundrums that can't be solved in 3 dimensions. But at any rate, you have God treating humanity sort of as a collective right from the start, and he decided, okay, he's going to split them up. First, there's a time when he actually destroyed all but 8 of them. Okay, and then from that 8, they came up, and then he split them up, and then he decided, he's going to take this one group, people born of Abraham, and they're going to be separate, and he's going to introduce them to these unique laws and these unique behaviors and unique systems and so forth, and they were to be sort of a light to the world. If they did what he said, then they would be on this resonance with his creation that would produce this great prosperity and so forth, and people would see that and realize that they're on the resonating with the Creator and so forth. And he did this, I think, in such a way that he was seeking to provide a lesson to the world that if you have this ethnic based approach to it's like an ethnic biological approach to resonating with God, that it's going to fail. Okay, that I believe was the lesson, lost on Muslims and pagans, but the lesson was, okay, here's your biological ethnic experiment, and it will fail, because the spirit the Spirit of God has gone out of man from the fall. And it can't be retrieved through biology. Okay, and biology, is a product of intellect, of God's intellect. So, it goes back to what I was saying before about, in the mind trumping biology. Jesus was described as the Word of God, and he had the Word of life, and so, there's this idea that there is a greater reality that needs to be infused. One of the here's a satisfying philosophical way of looking at this is that, okay, we were, you're born into this world, and you eventually gain awareness, to the point when usually people are about 4 or 5 years old, maybe, then they start to say, hey, wait a minute, where did everything come from? What's going on here? They come to this realization that, wait a minute, this is weird, where did everything come from? And that part of that realization is this, realization that you didn't really have anything to do with it. You just found yourself here. And you are tested in life in a sense. This is the Jesus test part. It's be interesting to really unpack the Jesus test, because Jesus, whether you receive or reject Jesus is the difference between eternal life or eternal damnation, whatever that means. We can talk about that some other time, I guess, but it's not eternal life. Basically, I think that one of the elements that's really important there is this idea that, okay, you're now a conscious, aware being, and now you can choose whether you would rather have that life source that created everything in the first place be your source of justification and salvation and so forth. So you're sort of going back to, even as an older person, an adult or whatever, you're returning back to that original state of consciousness, sort of where you're saying, hey, wait a minute, there's awareness that you didn't have anything to do with it. You're not going to have anything to do with saving yourself either. That you can ask for salvation. So anyway, that to me that's kind of a satisfying philosophical thing, but that's not that to me that's kind of not the reason why you believe something. But anyway, I just want to throw that in there because trying to jibe the Old Testament with Jesus, how does it fit in? One of the other ways, I believe that the reason that it seems so harsh is because in the same sort of relationship that when children often see adult interactions, if an adult, for instance, has to be disciplined or something by another adult or something like that, it can seem harsh from a child's point of view. They're like, wow, some of the stuff that that adults say and do and so forth. often a child doesn't understand the necessity of the sternness, and I think that us as children of God don't, understand um, that dynamic from the point of a creator. I mean, if we also created our own universes and so forth, we might, be able to talk shop with God about that. We sort of understand. I mean, look, even employers and employees, there's a certain relationship that goes on there. Seems like it can be not as. I mean, it's not really a loving relationship, I mean, not terribly, I mean, it can have some of that dynamic, but I mean, there's different dynamics. My point is different dynamics to different kinds of relationships and so forth, and God and a God relationship to a humanity is going to be different than stuff that we're used to, and it's going to seem like, wow, I mean, it would be if it was. It would seem like a double standard if it was just another human being. Since it's God, I mean, the way I approach it is I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to say, well, look, I'm not going to say God has to have my standards. Whatever, because that's what a lot of times, humans will try to hold God to our human standard for certain things. There's not the appropriate way. You're not going to end up drawing the correct conclusions, I think. I mean, it's a good idea to to consider that you may be not capable of understanding something, even though even though it's happened. I mean, that's really sort of the nature of reality anyways. Reality's happened, and we really can't comprehend it, same thing with like consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness is one of those kind of things where we know that it exists, but it's not. I don't think that the brain has the equipment to understand the brain. The same way, the human doesn't have the equipment to understand reality. Even if you were able to go up a few dimensions, I think that you could look at it like this. Okay, if we have, I remember I made it. Remember I was telling you about my first YouTube channel. I think it was. It's still up there because I kept no control over it. It's I think it's still up there. It's Sean PWH. And PWH just came up randomly because we were trying to find something that wasn't used already, and I don't know, somehow that got accepted, and I just say PWH stands for probably won't hear. You're probably not going to hear what I'm saying, but anyway, I had made this video about the nature of reality and God in the Matrix and so forth, and that one had like over 30,000 views. But at any rate, it was this idea that you have different sets of dimensionality. Okay, we have this sort of four-dimensional. Now, some people say, well, space is just one of the dimensions, and time's another one, and it's kind of a two-dimensional thing. I don't have a problem with seeing space as three-dimensional. I don't think that's an inaccurate way of looking at it, in time. So you get four dimensions. So the angels, I had this angels living at 12 dimensions, and then there was the new heavens and new earth, 24 dimensions, I think, and then God's n-dimensional, so that, infinitely dimensional, maybe. That would probably be the right way to go about it, so that even if you had the advantage of the 24 dimensions of the new heavens and new earth, for instance, you still have a long way of understanding the nature of God, the reality of God. But it's not like this. It's not like this kind of. I know, from debating Muslims, they have this idea that, well, God is totally unknowable kind of thing. Well, why did he bother with the Quran then? I mean, you don't need the Quran if he's unknowable. The Quran can't have anything to contribute. You know what I mean? So, but that's it's kind of typical Islamic theology or thinking or whatever it is. It's kind of. It's illogical to the point of even, for instance, the idea that God can't lie. Okay, that God can't lie is, one of the characteristics of God. If he's truth, then there's no lying in him, Well, that Islamic view sort of even takes that off the table, and it's like, I don't know, but at any rate, so there we go. There's did I talk about? I did. Muhammad Ali choosing Islam for philosophical reasons. That's the wrong way to go about doing things. You can't, you can't do that. But at any rate, good. So I think I'm done for today. Next time I come up with some interesting ideas, I will, at least what I consider interesting, I will share them with you. Thanks for viewing. If there's anybody actually viewing these things, if they're even on YouTube, and maybe I'm just a shadow, channel that the only person that actually knows that I'm here is me. And nobody else actually can ever see me, I wouldn't know. How would you know? I guess I get a friend to go on his phone or something and say, hey, see if I actually exist out there, All right, man, take care.